Hi, Alyssa Essman, Weed Science State Extension Specialist for Ohio State. Today we are out at the Western Agricultural Research Station on a beautiful July day. It is the 10th of July and we are in the Battle for the Belt corn trials. Right, so we're looking at different planting dates and how that influences our agronomic considerations, but today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the weed management considerations that come up when we have widely varying planting dates. So here we are in the final planting date, so this is planting date 5 in June 17th, and there we have planting date 4, and you can see the difference in size between the corn that was planted in June versus that was planted around mid to late May, right? So we know for weed management, one of the things that we want to consider is the fact that the critical weed period is, the first 4 to 6 weeks of life. That's when those young crop plants are most sensitive to competition for things like rain, sunlight, and nutrients. And we know when we have low weed pressure during that time, we're going to maximize our yield, right? So not only when our planting dates vary are we changing things like sunlight interception potential and yield potential throughout the season, we're also influencing our weed pressure. And we can see here in these plots that were planted late, have not yet received a post-application, maybe burned down in April. We can see a clear difference in weed pressure between this plots and the previous 4 planting dates. Right, so here we have some lovely morning glory and some giant ragweed, and we can see the difference in size of these plants compared to the crop plant, right? So we know those plants are going to be a lot more competitive and competing with the crop a lot more than when we were able to get into the field earlier, have earlier planting dates, shade out the ground sooner and be more competitive from the crop's perspective compared to the weeds. All right, so now we're in the soybean plot. This is the last planting date for soybean, like we just saw in corn. These treatments just got an application sometime recently, and we can see the difference in size of these soybean plants and what this giant ragweed was at the time of application, right? So for later planting dates, it's especially important to be on top of our game. We know we have considerably less options for herbicide control in soybean, and the wide range of planting dates means we're going to have different growth stages, right? So the earlier we plant, the earlier we're going to flower. Right, so that means that pushes our pre-emergence herbicides earlier and also our posts. The first planting date of this trial was planted March 25th, and they were in R1 by May 28th, right? A lot of our post applications, the cutoff date is that R1 growth stage, and so we know that is going to restrict our options the earlier we plant. As we get into some of the middle planting dates, we'll see some reasonable canopy closure closer to what we consider to be normal, but in this really late planting date, we can see that there is clearly a difference in the size, and it means it's going to delay canopy closure, and it generally has an extended period of time where we're going to have to consider post applications, right? It also might change our weed spectrum. We might expect to be controlling some of the later emergers in this trial compared to those where we're treating some of the early emerging in those earlier planting dates that might have dropped off in germination patterns by the time this gets in the ground. So here we have planting date 4 on May 24th. We can see there's considerably more canopy closure than the 5th planting date. So here's the 3rd planting date on May 6th. Again, we see a progression of growth stage and canopy closure. Unlike the corn, this does have a seeding rate consideration, so there might be some differences in what we're seeing here relative to the corn that was looking at different hybrids. Here's planting date 2 on April 16th, once again at a more advanced growth stage, starting to approach canopy closure in this planting date relative to those that we've seen previously. And finally, we have the first planting date that was on March 25th. Again, these reached R1 about May 28th, right? So we know that there's just a wide range in differences in growth stages, which is going to influence our herbicide options and pretty much our whole strategy for weed management when we're looking at planting dates that are this variable. So regardless of what planting date we're able to get into the fields and get those activities completed, right? There's a lot of times where we get in, get things planted, and then we have really inclement weather, and we're not allowed to get in and spray at an adequate time following up on that. So in those situations, it's especially important that we're using referring to our herbicide labels and considering things like adjuvants, especially this year where we've had extended dry periods. right? We know those plants are developing thicker cuticles. It's harder for the herbicides to get into the plants, and so it's really important for us to have appropriate mixing and application procedures in times where environmental stresses are less than adequate. If you have more questions related to the identification or the management of weeds, feel free to contact me at Essman, ESSMAN.42 or check out the weeds website, u.osu.edu/OSU weeds. Corn or soybeans battle for the belt. So for last year, I went for a more weed management perspective, but this year I'm going for an agronomic perspective. And I think generally, if I was a farmer, I would be team soybean.